Okay. So thanks everybody for introducing yourselves. I'm going to introduce myself too, because even though I invited you all here either directly or indirectly, not actually everybody here knows me. So I'm Jen Abrams, and for uh, beginning in '08, after I worked very, very hard on the Obama campaign, I decided to sort of go hyper local with my political activism and have since been very active organizing around the local races that are sometimes harder to find information about, like judgeships and ballot measures and district leaders and city council as well. So I run a list where I share all of my research on these smaller races. And if you are not on that list and you want to be on it, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat and I'll put you on the list. But for tonight, I just put out the call to my neighbors and asked neighbors to invite other neighbors. So if you're here, you're my neighbor, and I'm glad to meet you, and I'm glad you're here. And thanks for being here. And of course, you know, we're here tonight to hear from Crystal Hudson, candidate for city council in our district. And many of you seem to know at least some of the wonderful things about her. Some of the reasons that I'm excited about her candidacy are her commitment to more transparency in the ULURP process, which is the land use review process. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to vote for someone who looks like me insofar as being a queer person and a visibly an out queer person. That's exciting to me. And I've just been really impressed by Crystal's thoughtfulness on how to get better participation of community members, especially through technology, when she's spoken to me about that. So those are some of the reasons I'm interested in Crystal's candidacy. And I think I'm just going to kick it to you, Crystal, to introduce yourself. And from there, we'll take it to questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Jen, for putting this together and for inviting me, of course. And thank you all for attending. I'm running for city council, as you know, in the 35th district to represent the neighborhoods of Prospect Heights, Crown Heights, Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, and Bed-Stuy. I am a third generation Brooklynite, and I'm a first generation American, which really just means, I always like to clarify because sometimes people are like, how does that actually work? I'm the first one in my family born here in the US, but my grandparents came here a very long time ago and settled in Brooklyn, and my mother followed. And my family is from Honduras and Jamaica. And so I'm very proudly, you know, both a first generation American and a third generation Brooklynite. I'm also the only child of a single mother who has Alzheimer's disease. And it was through my caregiving experience that I actually got into public service after I spent over 10 years working in sports marketing in a completely unrelated field. You know, I saw firsthand how difficult it is for regular families like mine to get access to services and resources and even just basic information. I think we've all seen that in the past year with the pandemic. You know, whether you have a child in school or you work in the school system, or you've been trying to get access to the vaccine most recently, I think there's just been a real lack of information and lack of resources in a way that I think so many of us actually need and rely on, especially those of us who are most marginalized. And so, you know, when I had the experience, you know, starting as a caregiver for my mother, this is, you know, going on 8 years ago now that, you know, she's been living with Alzheimer's disease, but, you know, it changed my perspective on everything. And I wanted to do work that felt more meaningful to me. I wanted to get into public service. I wanted to help change these systems that I found to be so onerous and bureaucratic. And I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to go to work on behalf of my local community. So I went to work for my local council member, who was Lori Cumbo. You know, for me, I wanted to have a direct impact on the community that's had such a strong role in me being who I am today. You know, I wanted to help my neighbors and the people that I've known, you know, my whole life, and those, you know, who I haven't and who are newer to the neighborhood. But I knew that I wanted to help change systems. And, you know, I was admittedly a bit naive going into it. I thought that, you know, as an eager person to help change a lot of these systems, that I would be able to do so. And then of course, got into it and realized it's not quite as easy as it seems. I grew up behind what is now the Barclay Center. And so brought with me the question of how does an entire community come out against something and it happens anyway. That was something that I had also seen firsthand. And I think we've seen that, time and time again. And my time in the city council and also in the public advocate's office, when I left the council member's office, I went to the public advocate's office. I was the first deputy public advocate for community engagement. Then I left there, I went back to the city council, worked in central staff, supporting all of the members. And so, my short time in city government has really allowed me the opportunity to see exactly how city government works, how to actually get things done within a bureaucratic system. And also I've seen really that ultimately what I think a lot of this comes down to is the political will and the courage to say no when you need to say no and say yes when you need to say yes. And I think, so often we don't have people who've had the political will and the courage to do, right by our community. And so I know, the type of leadership our community deserves, and that's the type of leadership that I'm offering and bringing to the table. The way that I see, government supporting our communities is really thinking about our full lifespan from birth to death. So, making sure that our educational system is one that provides a quality education for all of our students, particularly Black and Brown students who have not seen the same type of access to a quality education. And also, making sure that we all have access to good jobs with good wages. I'm a big proponent for union jobs in particular, because people of color benefit the most from union jobs and having those opportunities. And I think we do a lot of job training programs that doesn't actually place people into long-term jobs or even careers. And so I think we need to sort of stop talking about job training programs as a means to an end when I think so often we don't really follow the full course. I want to build more affordable housing, and particularly housing that is for those with the greatest need. So thinking about people, who are under and unemployed, who are coming out of the shelter system, people who are within the 0 to 30 or 50% area median income bracket. And even up to 80% is considered low income. So really focusing on 0 to 80%, but with a keen focus on 0 to 30 and 0 to 50%. I think we aren't building enough for the people with the greatest need. I think that's the bottom line. And I want to make sure that this district is also one where those of us who live here can afford to stay here. I also know what people who have come before all of us have done to make this district what it is. And I think it's a real shame when those are the folks that are first to get displaced and evicted and pushed out. And so we need to do more to sort of solidify our housing stock and these systems that force so many people out. And then really going into our older years, thinking about how do we ensure that as we age, we can do so safely and with dignity and respect. And I think, if we want to age in our homes, we should be able to do so the way that thankfully my mother has been able to do so. And we shouldn't be forced into nursing homes if we don't want to be in a nursing home, but that's the only place we can afford to be. I think younger people don't talk about seniors enough. 20% of New York City's population are seniors, and only 1% of New York City's budget goes towards seniors. And so I would love to see that gap closed. So that's how I think about this district, about New York as a whole, is really in a holistic way, like I said, across our full lifespan, and making sure that we are investing in our communities at every step along the way. And so that's a little bit about how I got here and, what I'm about, what I believe in. Jen mentioned, I am gay, I'm Black. I'm always saying I'm like unapologetically pro-Black, pro-queer, pro-justice. If I'm elected, I would be the first gay Black woman ever elected to the city council, which I think for some people is hard to believe that in 2021, that would be a historic milestone. For me, I can tell you, having been on the campaign trail for quite some time now, I fully understand why that is the case. There are just so many hoops for people like us to jump through, so many barriers for us to overcome, lots of misinformation, and so that we have to combat every step of the way. And so, I'm really proud to be running a historic campaign. I'm proud of the team that we've built from the ground up. And I'll just add, all of this is on my website, but we're not taking money from real estate. We're not taking money from police unions. I believe in community, and I believe in people and my community in particular. And I'm really proud of the fact that we've had support from a grassroots coalition of folks across the district. And I'm looking forward to growing that as we move closer to June.
Thanks, Crystal. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
all of that. We've got a couple of people who've joined since we did the intros. I'm going to keep us moving so that we can end on time. But I just want to say welcome to the folks who've joined us. And we're recording this meeting, so if you want to go back and see the beginning, the beginning of Crystal's introduction, you can do that later. Crystal, before we jump to questions, I just want to make sure that one particular part of your history is known to this group of people, in part because of some of the folks that I see who are specifically here, because you haven't spoken about your Prospect Heights mutual aid work yet. And I just want I want to make sure folks know about that.
Thank you so much. So I started Greater Prospect Heights Mutual Aid at the start of the pandemic in March. It's I think March 15th was a year. We looked back recently when we first launched the Google form for folks to sign up. And that was really because, living with my mother who has Alzheimer's disease. My mother is 79 years old. I look younger than I am, but she had me late in life or later in life, I should say. And so, it was thinking about the experience of my mother having younger people in the household. I live here with my mom and my partner. Having us in the household, we would be able to leave the house if we needed to get whatever we needed to get. And I was thinking about our neighbors, and so many of whom I know, who are also older but live alone and wouldn't have, the ability to do so. I was also working in the public advocate's office at the time, and I had access to a lot of information about COVID and the pandemic. Jumaane Williams was very vocal early on about, the mayor and governor not shutting down as soon as, in our estimation, we should have. And so to be honest, I was scared. I knew everything that I was hearing coming through the office, and I felt like people were not getting the information that they needed and that they should have. And so I thought the best way to make sure that my neighbors and my community would have that information was to, create a group. So I started actually with a WhatsApp group, and it grew from like 20 people to 200 people in just a couple of days. And so then we started the mutual aid organization because we realized that, we would probably hit a point when older folks or immunocompromised folks or people with underlying conditions or whatever have you would not be able to leave their homes, or at least would be recommended not to leave their homes. And so we thought that, we can create a network of people who would be able to do some of those things and run those errands for folks. And also the spirit of mutual aid from, way back when is really rooted in, Black and Indigenous ways of life of, literally mutual aid, right? Like providing for community. I always, in the context of socialism, right? I always talk about the fact that Black people have been socialists since the beginning of time. The 7 principles of Kwanzaa are all socialist principles, essentially. And I think, it's a way that Black people and people of color live, but don't often identify it as such, and don't often think about, maybe now we talk about mutual aid, and it's because there's so many mutual aid organizations and so much mutual aid that we've seen across the country, that now we talk about it, in our day-to-day conversations. But a year plus ago, nobody was really talking about mutual aid in the same way. And so what we've done is we've created a community of 600 people, and it's still growing, that have basically raised their hands and said, I want to be helpful, to however I can be helpful. I want to be helpful. What we did over the summer, well, we started in April, community conversations, a weekly community call. That for me was also really important because I wanted to cultivate community. I felt like, one of the silver linings, I would say, in this pandemic has been the opportunity for people to get to know their neighbors, right? You're not like leaving the house in the morning and rushing off to the subway and not looking up. You're maybe noticing who lives next door to you for the first time in a long time. And so it was important to me that we actually cultivate those relationships and build community. So we did a weekly community call every Thursday night. And then as we got into the summer months and the protests after George Floyd's death and others started, we shifted the conversation to actually focus on race relations and policing in the communities specifically. And we had really robust conversations. We created a safe space for people of all backgrounds to come together and talk about really difficult things. I always say, I'm here to talk about race because I think that's one of the things that is most difficult for so many people to talk about. And it's very important to me that we talk about race because I believe that race is really at the center and the root of everything. I launched a Black agenda for New York City last month during Black History Month, which for me, that is essentially a blueprint or a starting point for city government to undo and address and dismantle the really racist and anti-Black policies that we have in place. And I think we don't talk about Black people or race or racism enough. I know it feels like we talk about it a lot, but I feel like we talk around it a lot, but we don't actually like dig in and have the really honest conversations that I think we need to have and that I think are really valuable to our communities. And so anyway, I'm always here to talk about race. And so we created, this space where our community came together every week for, I think, about 2 or 3 months, where we talked just about race and policing. This was also at a time, I'm sure most of you remember, it felt like the Barclays Center was the police headquarters, during the protests. And we wrote a letter actually and collected over 1,000 signatures from neighbors. We wrote a letter to the mayor basically saying and demanding that, the police no longer use our community as its headquarters. We had the barricades up on every street. People were asked to show ID just to get home. And of course, that creates an unsafe environment for those who might be undocumented, for people of color, who just have, natural distrust of police. And also it's illegal. So we had one of our neighbors who is a public defender got in touch with a legal aid attorney who then had legal aid write a letter in support of our initial letter and basically demanded that the police stop the illegal practice of asking people for IDs in the street. And so we were able to make that happen. And all of that came out of, our conversations with one another and people sharing that they felt unsafe walking in their own neighborhoods, in and out of their own homes. And then, we still deliver groceries to families in need on a weekly basis. We just had a huge fundraising effort. We raised, I think, over $15,000 to really just keep our grocery program going. And the other thing I would say is unique about GPHMA, I think, and differentiates us from a lot of the other mutual aid organizations, and that was something that was really important to me, is again, going back to the idea of cultivating one-on-one interactions and relationships with our neighbors. And so our grocery program, you'll see we are a lower volume mutual aid organization. And by that, I mean, so many of the other mutual aid organizations serve hundreds and thousands of people on a weekly basis. and everybody gets the same thing. And so what we do is we're lower volume, so we're serving, several dozen families, but not hundreds of families. But everybody has a grocery shopper, and they might have a team of like 2 to 3 people just based on people's schedules. Not everybody's able to make a weekly commitment. But they have the same sort of like pod, if you will, since that's now a familiar term for us too, of people who deliver their groceries. It's the same people. And we've seen so many amazing relationships cultivated through that specific method. So not only do we allow people the opportunity to buy whatever they want to buy, so culturally relevant foods as well. And so many of our families that we serve are undocumented families, are families of color. So many of them are older people who are on a fixed income, who have never really been able to buy the foods that they would like to buy because they're on a fixed income and they've been limited in what they've been able to buy, or they're limited by public assistance with what they can actually buy, what they're allowed to buy. And so our program allows them the opportunity to buy whatever it is they want to buy. And one story I always love sharing is we have a woman who was, her grocery shoppers were a couple, and they lived right next door to her. And it's a young couple, and they said, it's amazing that we've never seen our next door neighbors, and we would have never known who our next door neighbors were if it wasn't for the mutual aid organizations. And then they got pregnant during COVID, they had a baby. And when they had the baby, they said they were no longer able to, get the groceries for her because they were focused on, of course, the new baby at home. And so we assigned a new grocery shopper, but then the woman who they were buying groceries for was a caterer, and she was out of work, the whole year she's been out of work. She was let go. And she started making meals for them because they were at home with their newborn baby. And that is literally what mutual aid is. When you're in need and people are there to help you, there will be a time that comes, whatever it may be. It may look different. Your source of help or support may look different from the support or the help that you were once receiving. But the idea is that you do what you can for your neighbors and for the community when you can do it. And so that's a story I always love sharing, because I think it's just so beautiful. And they are now, like very, very close friends, and they speak often. And the woman that they were buying groceries for is now involved in like the new baby's life, and, keeps up with everything that's going on. And, that was always the vision for Greater Prospect Heights Mutual Aid, was to create, to foster community, to foster relationships, and to cultivate, a real sense of belonging and community. I think so often too, we sort of talk about like the people who've been in the neighborhood for a long time, and then like people who've not been in the neighborhood for a long time. We talk about gentrification and we talk about displacement and all of that. But I think less frequently we talk about the ways in which people actually come together, and the ways in which new residents to the neighborhood actually reach out to older residents in the neighborhood, or vice versa. And I think we need to create more opportunities for that to happen. And instead of always trying to push everybody against each other or push everybody apart, I think we need to be doing more to bring people together.
Thanks.
Sorry, I know I rambled on a little bit about that.
Well, I was going to say, I can see how much of your heart
baby
is in that work.
Yeah,
I can see how much of your work, your heart is present in that work.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got about a half an hour that we can use for questions. So if you've got a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat. Or if anybody wants,
I'll jump at once.
I know. Go ahead, Vicky. You're on mute though. You're still on mute.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, hi. Sorry for being late. I just want to say, Crystal, I love your empathy, and it's too often that people who go into politics kind of either never had it or lost it. And I'm a former school teacher in New York City, and I've been living in Prospect Heights for 20 years now. And I've seen a lot of change in this neighborhood on my block. Some of it I like, some of it I don't like. And I'm wondering about, like, with the schools, I read some of, I didn't get to your website, but I read, I think it was an interview about, you were concerned about the way Black girls are punished in the school system, and Black boys. I mean, I was privy to all that when I was working in the school system, and I was appalled. And I was wondering what, perhaps, if you had any ideas about what we could do about that.
Yeah, so one thing I'm really passionate about is addressing and undoing really what's called school pushout, which disproportionately impacts Black girls, more than any other student demographic. And what it is just the over disciplining and over policing of Black girls, everything from hairstyles to clothing, to the way they talk, the way they walk, everything is a problem by the system that we have in place. And this is, again, why I always talk about race, because it is at the root of all of our issues, I believe. And so, I think, number one, we have to remove police from our schools. I don't think police create safe environments for our students. I think what creates safe environments for our students are social workers and nurses and mental health professionals, and teachers and school administrators. It's not police officers. And so that's one way for sure that we can address those issues. And I think also investing in our youth, investing in our schools. I think, Marielle, it was you who talked about defunding the NYPD. But that's a perfect example of why we need to reallocate resources from our, police force into, schools and youth and after school programs and other opportunities for youth. Summer youth employment program. We saw last year around this time, the first thing the mayor put on the table to cut was the summer youth employment program. And that is a program that has been proven to work for years and years and years, and is predominantly Black and brown, low income students who need that summer money to help support their families. And there's no reason why that should be the first thing to be cut, as opposed to the extremely bloated NYPD budget. I think Peter jumped off, but he mentioned specifically the patrol. Patrol is like what actually needs to be cut. I think we talk a lot about defunding the NYPD and don't always understand what that actually means or how it can, make a difference. And I've talked to plenty of people in the community who don't want to defund the NYPD, but it's because they don't understand what defunding the NYPD really means. And, that is reallocating resources into our communities and into those who've never been invested in, quite literally. And then we saw, especially those of us here in this neighborhood, we saw how, armed they were for peaceful protests, right? Like, there's no reason why police should be coming to a peaceful protest with, bulletproof vests and helmets and batons and like all this extra gear. And then our kids in schools don't have textbooks and computer labs. And then when the pandemic started, kids didn't have, the devices they needed to learn from home. I mean, the disparity is it's wild. And so, those are just some of the ways that I think we can start to address the school system, the issues in the school system, and specifically, the over policing and over disciplining of Black girls. And thank you for asking that question.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Thanks, Vicki. We have 2 questions in the chat, so we'll go to those next. One of them's from Jenny, who had to jump off. But she was asking if you can talk in more detail about your Black agenda. And after that, we'll go to Marielle's question. And folks, that gives other folks a little bit of time and space to think about what you all might want to ask too. So you can go ahead and put it in the chat when you're ready.
Sure, and I'll drop the link for the Black agenda in a moment so everybody can check it out. I mean, it's, you know, it's not light reading. It's a 35-page policy platform essentially, but it hits, you know, every single, thanks, Katie. It hits every single, you know, issue area really. But I have 6 bold recommendations that I'll just run through quickly. One is to put money directly in Black New Yorkers' hands with baby bonds and a guaranteed paycheck. One is to create a pipeline for non-law enforcement union jobs for Black New Yorkers. Another is to pilot a basic income program in zip codes with the highest rates of gun violence. So often we don't talk about gun violence and the way that it impacts Black and brown communities in particular. And you know, we know what so much of the source of that violence is, which is a lack of economic opportunity, a lack of, you know, access to real healthcare, to real quality education. And so if these communities had access to all of those resources, then, you know, we would see a lot of the violence decrease. And so one of the ways I think we should be able to do that is to invest in those communities and put money directly in people's hands so they don't feel like they have to turn to the streets to put food, you know, on their table. I also want to launch a citywide truth and reconciliation process that's focused on race and reparations. So thinking about how the city as a municipal government can actually address the wrongs that we have, you know, experienced for generations, build Black generational wealth and prevent displacement through community home ownership. So what that looks like for me is, you know, thinking about so many of the housing issues, the tenant issues that we see. When I was in the public advocate's office, you know, well, the public advocate's office, no matter who the public advocate is, releases an annual report of the worst landlords in New York City. And, you know, I don't think we do enough to actually eradicate, you know, the hazardous living conditions that people have and people have to endure from predatory landlords. I mean, from NYCHA as well, that's a whole other issue. And not one that the city council has a whole lot of control over. But I think that, you know, the city used to have programs where they took property away from, you know, bad landlords. And basically they ran out of money, you know, from buying the properties. I think that we need to find a way to, you know, rejuvenate some of those programs, bring some of those programs back. And find a way to subsidize, you know, the costs for some of those programs. But I think what we should be doing is when you have a building, and I mean, some of the stuff I've seen, you would not believe, like literally holes in walls and ceilings. I heard from a mother once who had a newborn baby. She couldn't put the baby down because the roaches and rodents were so infested in the apartment that the baby would be covered. If she ever let the baby, you know, put the baby down and let the baby out of her hands. And there's no reason why people should be living in conditions like that, not here in New York City, and what I know is the best city in the world. And so I think what we should do is we should remove those properties from owners who have not been able to uphold healthy and safe living conditions, and put ownership in the tenants' hands and create community land trusts that create affordable housing in perpetuity, and support those tenants to operate and maintain their own buildings without forcing them to leave, you know, and then also creating a city racial equity commission that evaluates every new piece of policy and legislation that comes through. So often too, what the city council does is they introduce legislation and they pass legislation, and at no point do we ever think about the impact that that legislation may have on communities that are most marginalized. And so I think we need to start doing that. So those are the 6 bold recommendations that I have at the top of my Black agenda. But again, like I said, it's a 35-page policy platform that really goes through each area, from environmental justice to housing to education to healthcare, and addresses and talks about how do we actually center Black people in the work that we're doing? How do we dismantle the racist and anti-Black systems that we know have been in place forever, essentially? And also, it's to say it's not an exclusive document that excludes everybody else. It is an inclusive platform that basically says, when Black people fare well, everybody else fares well. And we know that to be the case. And so we just need to do a better job of actually investing in Black people and Black communities, and giving us the resources and services and programming that we need, so that, we can do just as good as everybody else has been doing.
Thanks, Crystal. We have questions queued up from 3 more folks, and we have about 15 minutes left. So let's try and
Yes, okay.
So Marielle has a lot of progressive folks in our district are split between voting for you and Michael Hollingsworth. Why are you the better choice for our district, and why should we vote for you over Michael?
Yes, so 2 things. One is, you don't have to vote for one or the other. We have ranked choice voting, which means you can, select up to 5 people on your on election day, or however you choose to vote. So, I think why people should put me first is because, I do have experience in city government. I'm actually the only candidate running. I think there are 9 of us who has any experience in city government. And I think as we're looking to recover, not just from the pandemic, but from the economy, from the racial reckoning that we've seen, we need somebody who can hit the ground running. I think that is going to be increasingly important, especially when we think about the turnover that we're going to see. There are 35 open seats out of 51 in the city council. You also have all of the citywide positions that are open: the mayor, the comptroller, the public advocate. And I think at a time like this, such a critical time, we just can't afford to have people who don't know what they're doing in office. And like I said, I only got into public service a couple of years ago. I think 3 years ago. It was the beginning of 2018. And so I'm not somebody who's a career politician. I've not been in this space for 10, 15 years. I spent the majority of my career in sports marketing, like I mentioned, in a completely unrelated field. But city government is sort of like, you don't need a whole lot of time to get acclimated. And so the 3 years that I've had have been incredibly valuable, and have given me insight. I think if you wait until you're already elected and you are then expected to deliver, that's when it becomes a lot more difficult. But as a staffer, I think, you see a lot, you do a lot, and you understand all the different ways in which government can work and doesn't work. And right, like that's also how I entered into government, was having a personal experience of government not working for me in a way that I knew it should, and a way that it should work for so many others. So I would say that's, one benefit. And then also, again, if I'm elected, I'd be the first gay Black woman ever elected to the city council. And I do think that representation matters. I think it's important that we show our young people what is possible. And so electing me would, help to show us that.
Way to go. That was 4 minutes. we got Mahit's question. Crystal, can you please talk about your transportation priorities? How do you think the city should invest in the subway given the state control of the MTA? How will you get car owners to welcome pedestrian streets and protected bike lanes, even if they conflict with parking?
So I am definitely going to advocate for local municipal control over the MTA. I know that's not something that's going to necessarily happen or come to fruition immediately. But I do think that those of us who use the MTA and public transit system should be in control of it. And so I think also, for the more immediate, it's taxing the rich in order to invest in our public transit system. It's also eliminating programs like 421A, and J51 tax abatement programs that rich developers get and use to circumvent paying taxes. And then we are the ones that miss out on the opportunity for real investments in our transit system. And then in terms of car owners welcoming pedestrian streets, I think we have to always prioritize, the tiniest person, right? Or the tiniest thing on the street. And so that is pedestrians, people on bikes, people walking, people with strollers, people in wheelchairs. Those are the people that we should be building and designing our streets for. And then cars sort of come last and they can figure it out. And that's not to say that we don't need also an equitable transportation system. And, there are a lot of communities of color and further out parts of the boroughs that don't have access to transit, to public transit. And so we need to make sure that what we're doing is in an equitable way. But I certainly think, particularly in our neighborhoods and in our district, which is, I would say, public transit rich, we should be prioritizing the safety of pedestrians. I also, ride my bike. And so I would love to see a continuous bike network in terms of bike lanes, and also like street calming or traffic calming infrastructure, which means like those bump outs at the corners when you're crossing the street that make the distance that you're actually crossing a lot shorter. Those are all the things that I'm very much interested in. And I believe it's on my website, transportation plan.
Thanks so much, Crystal. We've got from Sharon, our community is a home to a number of diverse arts and culture organizations. What's your position on support for this sector? What's your position on the Franklin Avenue development that would adversely affect the Brooklyn Botanic Garden?
So, it's the arts and culture industry and sector that has really made, I think, the 35th district the best district in all of New York City. We are home to Brooklyn's cultural district. But I've grown up going to all of these institutions, going to BAM, going to the Brooklyn Museum, going to the Botanic Garden, and also to smaller, studios and theaters. And so I think we need to do everything we can to bring those folks back to work and to allow us also some reprieve. And give us the opportunity to enjoy, music and the arts and culture again. I think in terms of that development, I've always been in opposition to that development. I think most of the candidates are, if not all of them, as well as the mayor. That development, in my view, I would say the good elements of it are the fact that it's 50% affordable housing and that it is union built, union funded, right? But I think that is separate and apart from, like, the entity is separate and apart from the process and the height and all of that. And what I think has happened and happens all of the time is that developers come into a community with an already built and designed project. And then they say, you must fit this in because this is our vision for your community. And we'll make some tweaks and maybe change a window or, reduce by a floor or two to make you happy. But we're not really interested in or thinking about what it is you want or what it is you need. And so I have a couple of proposals to address that process specifically, which I know Jen mentioned at the very top, the ULERP process, which is a uniform land use review procedure. But basically, I think that project, it's not appropriate for the community. And I think what we need to do is have developers come in at a much earlier point in the process and really meaningfully engage communities. And communities should be part of the design process. They should decide, I want 1,000 or 2,000 square foot spaces in your retail space so that small businesses can thrive and can sustain themselves, as opposed to 10,000 square foot spaces that are only going to allow, Dwayne Reeds and Chase Banks and all of that sort of thing. We need daycare instead of, whatever else they may be, a Starbucks, for example. And I think we really do have to do a better job of ensuring that community's voice has a much stronger role, and like I said, I've seen firsthand as somebody who grew up behind the Barclays Center, you know, how that whole Atlantic Yards project, you know, we still don't have the affordable units we were promised. We still don't have the jobs we were promised. There's still construction. There are kids who've grown up in this neighborhood who have never not known construction. And you know, that's a problem. That was a state deal. It wasn't at the city level, but everybody was involved. And this goes back to what I was saying before about having the political will and the courage to say no to the things that need to be said no to.
So Crystal, I'm going to head us towards wrapping up this meeting. We've got about 8 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is tag on to the end of what you were just saying, because you've spoken to me in some detail about your vision for how to, like, what the actual brass tacks of creating a more inclusive city planning process would be, and specifically how to get more affordable housing into the district. So I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit, in a little bit more detail. And then also Dahlia's question, it's her first question about defund is like sort of a yes or no one, but she's also curious to hear about how you might sell that idea to constituents, including Black and Brown constituents who might be concerned about gun violence. So that's a two-parter, and I think that'll take us to the end.
Okay, so in terms of affordable housing and development and that whole, you know, bit, like I mentioned, I have a number of proposals, you know, one of which is to create legal accountability or a legal mechanism that would hold developers accountable for actually doing the things they say they will do, like in the community board as part of the process of the ULURP process or the ULURP procedure. And so what that means is, instead of a community board saying or making recommendations that are then not heeded by the developer, they're not heeded by the city council member, and the city council member goes and makes, you know, votes, let's say, in favor of something that the community board said they didn't want, there has to be a legal mechanism that holds those developers accountable, that says, you promised you would do X, Y, and Z, and thus you must now do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to hold you legally accountable. Or there's some sort of, you know, fine or repercussion for them not delivering X, Y, and Z. You know, I think also we have to talk about, especially at a time like now when, you know, the economy is in a bad way and we don't have the funds that we have had. I always say, though, never believe anybody in government when they tell you there's no money for anything, because there's always more money. But we do have less money than we usually do, and that is true. But I think we have to look, you know, to things like legalizing marijuana, and like I said before, taxing the rich, and, you know, creating real subsidies. I think also something I'm really interested in doing is leveraging faith-based communities and properties that houses of worship sit on that are underutilized and even unused, because when you find people and nonprofit developers whose mission it is to actually serve community, then you find that the projects are a lot better and might be 100% affordable. But oftentimes those folks are shut out of the RFP process, the request for proposal process. So the city will put out certain requirements that are essentially a giveaway to private developers, right? They know what the thresholds are that private developers can meet. And so they set those thresholds particularly high so that nonprofit developers and churches and synagogues and mosques cannot actually apply for the subsidies. And so we need to change the way, you know, that process is done. We need to make it, you know, we need to make that process more accessible for the people who have the mission of building affordable housing for those with the greatest need, you know, in mind. And then the bit about, was it policing or gun violence?
It was the question was specifically, how do you sell the idea of defund, especially to people who might have concerns about gun violence?
So I have those conversations all the time, actually. And I think, you know, a lot of it comes down to people taking something at face value and not really understanding the deeper, not even just the issues at play, but what defunding the NYPD really means. And I think, people who've been victims of gun violence or any other sort of violent crime, don't want to feel like their safety is in jeopardy, or that, police will be pulled away from them when they feel like they need police in order to keep them safe. And the thing I always say is that it's not police who keep us safe. It's us who keep us safe. It's our communities who keep us safe. It's an education, a quality education that keeps us safe. It's a job that keeps us safe. It's safe and secure housing and affordable housing that keeps us in our homes, that keep us safe. And it's programming, it's social services, it's all of those resources that keep us safe. Police arrive once the thing has already happened. Once that violent crime has already occurred, that's when police show up. They're not there usually, certainly not in Black and brown neighborhoods. They're not there keeping people safe before the thing, or else the thing wouldn't have happened that called them in, And so those are the conversations that I have with those folks. And I always say too, I am an abolitionist, and I do believe that we can have a world and a future where we don't have cops, but I also know and understand that we're not going to get there tomorrow. And so between now and then, defunding the NYPD does not mean removing every single police officer from the streets. And so the communities that feel like they need some visual, sense of safety, the cops aren't really going anywhere. And so, what I'm trying to do with defunding the NYPD is to prevent the increase of, or increasing the police force. We have more than enough cops. We have more cops per capita in New York than we have teachers per head, per student in our school system. And that just shouldn't be the case. So I don't think we should be hiring any more police until we can get our numbers up in every other area. There should be, we've seen with our public hospital system during the pandemic, how at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, people were wrapped around the hospital trying to get in to be, dealt with, to be serviced. Yeah. And that should never be the case, where people can't get access to healthcare, they can't get a quality education, but they can get apprehended and beat and run down and shot and killed, on a dime like that. So, and I will tell you, when I have those conversations with people, like 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, they get on board and they understand what defunding the NYPD is, and they realize that it is beneficial to all of us.
So we're right at 7:30, and I'm going to wrap us up so that everybody can move on with their evenings. But before I do that, I just want to ask Katie to drop the link if you've been inspired by what Crystal has to say and you're interested in volunteering for the campaign. I know you're still petitioning to get on the ballot, and I know there's a lot of
You're done petitioning.
Oh, you're done petitioning.
Yeah. We did everything. We hit our goal early on, which I'm thankful for, which means that we don't have to have people in the streets for as long as we thought we might. So.
But I'm sure the campaign does need volunteers. So if folks are inspired and this is what you want to be into, then please check out the link that Katie just dropped. And of course, if you are interested in supporting Crystal with some money, the link for that is also in the chat right now.
I'd say volunteers are definitely the priority.
All right, that's good to hear.
I'll say volunteers over money any day.
I think that's saying something right there. I want to really thank everybody who showed up tonight. I know, like, we've all gotten sort of weirdly busy in the Zoomiverse, and it's just a different kind of busy that we are. And I know that a lot of us are on Zooms all day, and so I'm just really grateful to everybody who came tonight. It's pretty easy to coast by without paying a ton of attention, and it's pretty easy to not be responsible and thoughtful with your vote. So I just have so much love and admiration for folks who take the time and the care to engage with one of the many ways that we have power as citizens in this city. So so thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much, Crystal, for spending some time with us.
Thank you.
Really appreciated hearing your point of view on all of these issues, and I'm excited about what you've had to say. And I think probably others are
Putting
too.
it together.
Yeah. So we'll close us up, and maybe if folks want to just unmute themselves and give a wave and a thanks, we can do that.
Okay.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye, Jen.